So I'd like to begin by acknowledging country. So I invite you to notice your breath and to feel into the rhythm of that river of life force, which is breathing us. And I invite you to imagine or perceive or sense that the land, the sky, the sea, and all of the mystery in between, that all of this is breathing you, dreaming you. And I acknowledge that I am in the sacred, unceded, and stolen lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples in so-called Sydney, where I've lived for nearly 4 years now, very close to the site of the original British invasion. And I acknowledge their elders, past and present. I acknowledge their stories and cultures, sciences, and governing systems, which survive and have adapted in the face of colonization. I acknowledge the dreaming creators and spirits and old people who make up the sanctity of country, which is a way that Aboriginal people talk about the accumulated ancestral powerful story, like virtue, maybe some of us would say, or sovereignty or relational memory, which is unfolding of all things. So I want to acknowledge that and know that I am inside of it, possibly as an unwanted guest, and I will try my best every day to be a good guest. So now I'm going to pass it over to you, Aidan.
Yeah, so I'm sitting here, squatting as I think about it, um, on the ancestral lands of the Lummi, Nooksack, and Coast Salish people, and give my respect to the care that they have taken here and continue to take here. Uh, it's interesting here because there's such an overlay between the town and the forest, because I'm right in the forest, really. And so in the forest, I feel more of them, or in town, I feel more of the folks that came after. Uh, but I'm hugely appreciated that they allow me to stay here, and that my ancestral peeps and theirs seem to be able to coexist, at least in the magical sense, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes me think of how often I um every so often and often I invite people who ask me about this to go to a powerful place where you feel okay to be in the land and to in some way tell the story of your ancestors, warts and all, to the land. Um, and that may be nonverbal through movement. It might be through reading a letter you wrote. It might be through listening. It might be through poetry. But doing that in different places where your maybe your ethnic roots, your ancestral roots are not from can be really deeply profound. Um, that telling the story of the ancestors. And sometimes almost many maybe modern Western people don't think about that too often, maybe as well. This idea of like, oh, I can tell the story of my ancestors, and also part of that story will be often for many of us, I don't know, or my parents didn't tell me, or my grandparents didn't tell me, or I know as much as 4 generations ago we fled Poland, and emigrated to what is now New York City or something. So that I think is also important in the storytelling. I think people get straight into this idea that they have to have this perfect like lineage of storytelling, and it's like, no, your storytelling will include I don't know. And I think that's
It's
a
a
really good point.
Yeah, that's a very good one. I have on my father's side, there's good history for about 500 years
Hmm.
back to England and Scotland. We were first wave from that side of the family coming in with the Pilgrims. So
Hmm.
not the Spanish wave, but the
Mm.
first English wave. Um, And then on my mother's side, like half Jewish, half Irish, don't know
Mm,
anything. That's what we know. Like,
mm, mm,
I'm the only one that even got back to, a couple of birth certificates back in Hungary for
mm.
the Jewish side. But other than that, no clue. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
That they just clearly attempted to move away from all of that, whatever that was for them, and
Yeah.
not bring any of that information forward.
How much does, I'm curious for you, how much does your like your ethnic ancestral makeup inspire or provoke or direct your magical practice?
Um, it's interesting to me. I didn't have an ancestor practice at all because of the nature of my immediate ancestors. I'm not a fan. Uh, I've often said my grandmothers were fabulous and everybody else can pretty much go and screw themselves. Um, and had a reading from Andrew McGregor from Toronto, who runs the Hermit's Lamp. And this was years ago. And he was like, your ancestors are actually kind of being obstruction to what you're doing now. And you probably need to like work that relationship. And I was straight up. I was like, no, I don't want to. And he's like, and he was funny because we're both punks. So we have a particular view of things. And he was like, no, like make the offerings, set up a shrine that would work for them, and then tell them to back off. Like that's a legit way to work with your ancestors. Like make the offerings and say, too bad you don't like the fact that this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. So here's your stuff. You need to settle down and move aside until you can support what I am. So most of my ancestral work is extreme deep line. I work with ancestors probably mostly that I think are what we'd consider largely pre-civilization for me. And those contacts are very strong. But what I would qualify that is if I could figure it out, like who knows, you know.
Mm. Yeah, I think that idea of or that reality of working with yeah, like maybe even pre-literate or pre what we think of as civilization. Yeah, these ancient foreparents and forebears, like I think that does come up for a lot of those of us who are so, so societally, politically, culturally, spiritually vagrants. Um, yeah, I think that is a thing. And I totally love that you just said that, this person, I think you said their name was Andrew McGregor, but like this person basically said to you, you can set up a shrine for your ancestors, give them offerings, and tell them to fuck off. That is so real. And I wish more people would know that. And I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, it was a big opener, So it's like coming from the Pilgrim folks, that was like, okay, I know that you guys were all Protestants and the Irish I knew were Catholics. Then we had the Jewish side, so I got everybody's kind of prayer books that would have made sense to them and made kind of appropriate offerings. It was just like, hey, thank you for getting me here, but you got to stay out of the way.
Yeah.
This is how I interface with what I perceive God to be.
Hmm.
Uh, Respect that or stay out of it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and ultimately, like, I feel, when I first came out to, well, actually, the funny story is my sister told my father while we were in Bali when I was like 12 that I was a witch. And that word, like, I didn't get to sit down with him. And I was 12. How could I possibly have contextualized that to him? Um, I didn't get to I didn't get to like say it in my own words, and she was being really annoyed at me that day, and so decided to just like blab it to my father. And of course, the way that English word is, it's a complex English word, which I happen to love, but the way it's translated to Balinese people and most people in the global South or slash anywhere that's colonized is is absolutely malicious evildoer, right? And so it didn't help that that week I then also had this very intense, I would say, shamanic initiation in which I was um, or like blasted open wide. Had this really intense nightmare slash vision of real world events that happened and then were confirmed the next day. And I spent all night vomiting on the ground, screaming war. And my dad thought I was possessed by evil spirits and was like exercising me in the Balinese way. But of course, that was not what was happening to me. I was like a month earlier, I had cast a spell to open my, psychic senses, and here it was. And so it hasn't stopped since. But I think it's really interesting to like have that identity, like those hedge identities or those hedge um, magical ecologies, political realities where maybe someone occupies like a crossroads, um, like a crossroads hedge experience, like witch, or sorcerer or conjurer or whatever it is, priestess even, and then
Hmm.
is both tainted by the other, and therefore, I use that word obviously ironically, but is like carrying that charge of the other world in such a way that people can sense it, perceive it, and respond to it. And certainly in my father's family now, like now that like he knows that I identify that way and practice that way, and it's been 25 years, and now and for years he's been able to contextualize it through his cultural lens as, a healer, a spirit worker, a Balian, which is like a Filipino, Indonesian, Balinese way of saying, shaman, really, like for lack of a better
Hmm.
word. Um, and so he'll just contextualize it that way. And I think it's really interesting how different cultures make sense of different spirit workers when we might have our own inner mythos or soul stories kind of running, which we don't always reveal. So, so I think that's also, just like, strategic, personal, cultural, and all of these things are constantly colliding. So I think, yeah, like certain ancestors, I have many Protestant and Catholic ancestors and Hindu ancestors, and I think many of them would look at me as maybe even anathema, but some of them definitely recently, especially my grandparents on my father's side, they would just look at me like their progeny. So it's really interesting to like have these cultural collisions going on all the time.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. And also, like, it was so funny. I've only recently, my father's passed, but he and I ended up on good terms. He died right before COVID started. And he was like a very staunch materialist. And so his concern was, that would occasionally come out was like, so you're essentially just like a charlatan who is doing this for,
Wow.
and it took some work to get him to like do that. But I could do that because he had a deep, lifelong kind of fascination and love for Native American culture, which I figured out in part later is that some of his mothers and fathers' friends were marriages between white folks and
Hmm.
native folks. So he grew up around some of those people. So that was very organic to him, I think. And so by being able to kind of bring in kind of generic concepts of kind of shamanism and things, which he'd read some anthropology about, that kind of opened him up to it.
Mm.
Um, and interestingly, some of the stuff that I think opened up things very close were on his side of the family. We have an ancestor who was a predatory child abuser. And I think when I began actually talking about that in public, there's a chunk of that family line that kind of has shown up.
Yeah.
They're not super vocal, but I can feel them now.
Yeah.
And they're like, thank you for like, because they were not in a cultural place to do anything about that,
Yeah. Yeah.
because these folks would have died in the 80s for the most part.
Yeah.
and so that was not a time for that. Uh, so I definitely see that. I think that we were so like, yeah, it's, revival tent preachers kind of thing on one side of the family. And then I think both the Catholic and the Jewish side had kind of rebelled against that to some degree. My grandmother still had the iconography around and still prayed the rosary, but she never went to church that I have any awareness of. And my grandfather on that side, uh, to the best of my knowledge, never ever mentioned that his background was Jewish.
Mm, hmm.
So they were kind of keeping that at a distance anyway. Um, and I think it's similar kind of things. And I don't know if you had this, but uh, you know, I was wearing a lot of makeup and had long,
Hmm.
pretty nails when I was 15 and got
Yeah.
both of my ears pierced when I was 14, which was not
Yeah,
done
me
where I
too.
was.
Yeah, me too.
Um, and got in a lot of fistfights because of it. Um, and, was pretty overtly not straight at whatever I wasn't sure what I was, but,
Mm,
my parents did get to have the experience of me as a teenager uh, kind of like letting my older boy dude out of the house in the
mm,
morning and then being like, oh, we kind of thought, but whatever. But they were so closed up, they never even said anything. I could
mm.
just kind of see like distress.
Yeah,
But they were emotionally completely locked down. So that was never kind of publicly discussed.
yeah. This conversation just makes me think of the nature of magic as it moves through bodies that are in places like so-called Australia, so-called USA, which are two, countries that have, at their root, deception, desire, continued lying. Like in order for those countries to exist, they have to kind of pay slight credence to the fact, like in Australia, everyone, including, like, it's like I think a lot of people who are not from here always are like, Fio, why are you so intent on acknowledging country every time? I'm like, well, one, that's the practice. That's what Aboriginal communities bare minimum desire and hope you'd do. But also, everyone at school does it. Everyone in the government does it, like, ideally, and at sports matches. So it's really common. And it's like this kind of like box to tick for some people. And even on planes, when you land, if it's an Australian airline, like, which I fly often domestically, right? Like, you hear it. They'll do it. The pilot will say it as you land, um, and so it's really enculturated. But it's just like this kind of slight credence. So it's just like, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, we stole it all. Oh, sorry about it. Sorry. And
We haven't quite got to the sorry part
yeah, I
on
know,
a
I know,
larger
I know
level.
that about the US. Because yeah, but it just makes me think of all of the realities of, like, people coming as settler colonizers, people coming as asylum seekers, refugees, people fleeing, people immigrating, all the reasons, the tumbling reasons that people end up in a place, and then the magic that you know, moves. And often I feel that there is like several histories and several stories that are going on at the same time. And I think that over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been some intelligent conversation about things like cultural respect, cultural appropriation, cultural understanding. There's been some, but then there's been like swings where, a lot of white folks who don't understand cultural complexity will be like, okay, well then we can only do white things and brown people can do brown things. And it's like, wow, that's so racialist. And what you're saying is actually not, well, the point, actually. And then, and then it drowns out legitimate contextualized perspective often, because then in relationship to that, other white folks will get really mad and angry. And I've literally been teaching workshops in person in the US where someone goes, "Oh, but I don't understand this because black people can do ballet." And I'm like, "Oh my God." Like, and then you have to sit down, like, you have to stop the workshop and you have to turn to the person. You have to explain why what they said was ridiculous and try to get through like so much bullshit. And so all that bullshit is in the psychic egregore of these countries we live in as symptoms of really intense problems. And yet some of the most powerful magic is when people can come together, in my experience, of a variety of like cultural, ethnic backgrounds and be really in a place when it's safe to be in that place, because it's often not, to share and connect and talk shop. I love when those spaces appear. But yeah, unfortunately, it's just not always available because the emotional, cultural understanding is not always present. I'm curious what you have noticed arise from your spirit contacts, your allies, your accomplices in this kind of work of like being in a place like the US where so much cultural I always think of it as cultural collision, but also like cultural braiding happens, to create things like Anderson Ferry, which I know you've studied and I am an initiate of. Like there are traditions that arise from this because of the very real history that has happened in places like Australia and the US. I'm curious about your reflections on that.
It's super interesting, and I have a funny one that I'll bring up just because it's so related in a way. So I got first introduced to magic in a real way, like having met somebody who practiced for the first time when I was 15. And I was living in a new neighborhood, maybe 10 miles from where I had been. Wasn't really pleased about it, but I was working full time. This was maybe a year after, so I'd left high school already and was working full time. So it wasn't a big deal. But this would have been in 82. So there wasn't a lot. I wasn't particularly attracted to Wicca, and that was what was out there. And ceremonial magic kind of confused me for a few more years. But I was walking down the street and I found a piece of, like, a page out of a book. And it was not a book that had the author or the book title on the page, it just had the page numbers, and it was just one page. And it was this breathing technique.
Mm.
And I was like, oh, well, this is clearly a sign. And we'll go from there with that. And it ended up that a few years later, I was working in a bookstore and we got in a bunch of books from Max Freedom Long.
Oh yeah.
And I was flipping through them and I'm like, oh, wait a second, I recognize the font and this. And I was able to find it and go, okay, so this is Max's version of Huna,
Of something.
which is
Yeah.
whatever that.
Yeah.
I guess you got to use that title because that's the only way you can describe it, but
Yeah.
it's not that thing. But there's influences of that into fairy,
Absolutely.
you know? And it's funny, like when it was like, and so I think it's a very, like even then, I think I was aware of how peculiar these processes were.
Mm.
Uh, and the fact that like the first things that kind of made sense to me, like energetically around magic, uh, was another super questionable source, which was Castaneda. My dad
Mm.
had those books, and I read the first three books because he had them. And they actually made sense to me as a worldview in a way
Mm.
that the one that I was being presented with didn't.
Yes. Yeah.
And that has always stuck with me. Like that, even if I go back to them now, I look at them knowing what I know about him and how crazy that all ended up as well. But I still look at that and go, of course, because this is speaking to who I am as far as a kind of language, a kind of vision of the world.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the piece that is kind of the key to making that cross-pollination work is to recognize that part and realize that this can still be coming through incredibly imperfect transmission,
Totally.
and that you don't have to defend the transmitter, you don't have to defend the
No,
transmission.
exactly.
You can just look at it and go, that spoke to something that is real in me, and it
Yes.
came out of that person because it was real for them.
Hmm.
They may be crazy, they may be sociopathic, whatever, they may be a cult leader,
Yeah.
but for whatever reason, they wouldn't have spent, in both Long and Castaned's case, decades
Hmm.
having this conversation. Now, they may
Hmm.
have known that they were being disingenuous about source. They
Sure.
may have known that they were doing that, but it was the only language that they had. Does this like make them awesome or it okay? No, not really.
Yeah.
But you can still look at it and go, okay, this was the key to my developing an animist view.
Yeah.
And it also explained to me a lot, or another way, another aspect of it is kind of because my allied spirits, I think, are kind of way back. Um, I think it's a big part of why Wicca and a lot of agricultural kind of calendar based paganisms
Hmm.
never made sense to me.
Hmm.
Because to me, and this sounds insane to most people, but that's super modern to me.
Hmm. No,
And
I
the
hear you.
sense
I
that
understand. Yep.
and the sense that I have of the stuff of the people that I'm in communication, meaning the spirit people, is that they're not that at all. Like
Yeah.
this idea of the British cunning folk in 12 to 1400 or whatever. Like, no, that's like way later.
Hmm.
It's not saying that what I have is better. It's just these are the people that talk to me. It's like
Yeah,
it's
this
not
is
really
your
my
wellspring.
choice.
Yeah.
This exactly. This is the
Yeah.
thing that I came tapped into, or that I did tap into at some moment, and it stayed. You know.
Yeah.
Um, I think that the U.S. is in such a fascinating thing because the moment we're in right now is one that and this is not to say, ooh, I saw it all coming in specific because I didn't, but as a child, I could see this was a trajectory that seemed likely.
Yes.
And, I found other people that, John Shirley had a science fiction series called A Song Called Youth it wasn't the best period of time for Shirley to be a great writer, but uh, was about something like this. And
Yeah.
later, Jack Womack had a series of books that they kind of lumped together under the ambient series that spoke to this. And even, what is it called? The Fifth Sacred Thing by Starhawk,
I was just literally thinking about that book right as you were talking.
or
Yeah.
The City Not Long After by Pat Murphy, were all books that kind of spoke to this kind of a moment.
Absolutely.
Um, And so it was always in my head. And so I've always think I've had that lens. And then I grew up as a magician, uh, largely in the Bay Area during the Satan scare.
Mm-hmm.
So we were doing protests specifically against that
Mm.
at the time that I was coming up. And so none of that stuff is super new. And so I've always seen that kind of like I've never, and it's because of that. I know I hadn't really thought of it this way. It's because of that sense that I've never wanted to be a part of anything that wanted a seat at the table with those systems.
Exactly. Burn the motherfucking table down.
Right? And it was again a thing because that was a really big thing for the
Yeah.
kind of neo-pagan community during that time was like
I know, right?
we can get legit with the fundamentalists or something. It's like, no, I don't want that. I want something
No, yeah.
better. I want something that
Yes.
acknowledges the issues for real, that
Yes.
acknowledges people like me who I can now say that because now we have language that goes as distinctly non-binary.
Yes.
Um, and I just simply had no language for most of the stuff coming up. And really until about maybe 15 years ago, all of it started kind of
Yes.
coming together for me
Yeah.
and going, I think I and a whole bunch of other people, I'm not special in this, have this kind of same subtext that is just incredibly driving, saying, I think we know something about a different way to do this.
Hmm.
And it's trying to come out through all of us in very also imperfect vehicles,
Absolutely.
because we can simply see, like, no, these systems have never functioned well. They have functioned okay for some people, but not that many.
Hmm.
And a bunch of us are like, yeah, I don't really care to have all this stuff if I could trade it for us being well, right? Because mostly we want to acquire all that stuff as insulation against the knowledge that we're unwell.
Hmm.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts percolating and moving through me now. Like one of the things I want to jump back to is this Castaneda Max Freedom Long thing, which is I actually still have never read a single Castaneda book, so I can't comment on that. But look, I have often been a voice in the broader Anderson Ferry network of lineages that has provoked, along with many others who've been initiated far longer than me, and often it's people of color who are doing this, provoked the conversation in that tradition of being of like, hey, we're a messy tradition and we have some messy roots. It's actually really important to be clear with our students about that. Um, and so I don't pretend, some folks in the tradition or the various forms of the tradition have basically decided to like take out certain languaging, right? That is kind of like indicative of the literal cultural appropriation. Um, and rather than that, that's not what I do. I mean, I never was into using the so-called Hawaiian terms or the Huna Max Freedom long terms for the three souls. That was never. I already was like, oh no, thanks. But I say to people that I've taught to, I'm like, hey, just so you know, this is a thing. Also, I'm going to teach you now this thing that different fairy people call different names. And actually, originally, it seems that the Andersons didn't call this Kala or Kala Kala. They actually called it the water trick, which exists in Hoodoo and Southern Conjure cultures. But they seem to have learnt this from maybe Hawaiian people they know, because through people who have read vastly in like the Max Freedom Long Huna content, there's nothing in there that looks anything like that process. So this
No.
indicates that where Victor and Cora lived, which was surrounded by Mexican folks and Polynesian folks, that there probably was some connection because they did have several contacts and friends in that community. So it's probably like like Victor. Someone said, "Oh, Victor, this is like what we do, Kala Kala." And he probably went, influenced by New Thought movements, influenced by being American in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, he was like, okay, well, then it's also called this. Because he
Exactly.
had this universalist thing. And I just have to say that my father and his family, they do the same thing. So sometimes my friends come over to Bali who are Western witches, and we talk a bit about what we do. And of course, they then go, oh, yeah, that's like a Balian. You're a and that sometimes to the point where they'll say you're a Balian, and it's not that those people go back and say that about themselves, borrowing or using a Balinese title. It's just that there's cross-cultural understandings of things. And so I wish people had that nuance. And I think also I wish people understood that, yeah, what you said about not defending them. Like I never defend the act of like rampant, disingenuous, whatever. But I actually don't believe that's what Victor and Cora were doing. I think sometimes Victor especially could get very, from all the stories I've heard, consistently he could get very angry and righteous about certain things. But ultimately, I think that he himself really understood his ethnicity in a particular context and his magic in a particular context. And that is that there's nuance there, right? And so I think a lot of people who are looking for like, especially in the last maybe even like 30 to 40 years from what I can understand, there's this like desire in places like the US and Australia for cultural and ethnic authenticity. And it's like, well, look, the most that word is so belabored at this point. The most authentic thing is just being real with the mess, probably. Being real with the mess of all of it because of empire, colonization, capitalism, because of that. And so the folk process inside of that, that happens over decades, which forms things like Anderson Fairy. That's a folk process influenced by New Thought, literature, the weird psychic periodicals that, by the way, we have and can clearly see that Victor was already practicing a psychic spirit working craft in the 1940s prior to Gerald Gardner publishing his book, right? So all of these
Right.
conversations about who started this and blah de blah blah, because I pay close attention to all those conversations and I have read, and have access to different things. I just know that at some point in the 1940s, in various English speaking parts of the world, there was a sudden, like, maybe not a sudden because it had deeper roots than that, but there was this yeah, witchcraft revival, and it happened quietly at first, obviously. Like people got initiated into clandestine groups, like Victor, like Gerald Gardner, like Rosalie Norton, in this country where I live in the 40s, right? And so it's interesting to me that that happened, and then to fast forward to what you said about 15 years ago, in 2009, 2010, there was this thing that happened. I can't put my finger on it, but it happened. And and when you said that, you were like 15 years ago, I was like, yes, you're right, 15 years ago. Because I remember in 2010, so 2010 was when I stepped fully into what I call self spirits community employed work. And I just had no other work. This is all I do now and have done for 15 years. And I trusted it. It was a great risk. And there were several years of financial precarity. Um, but I went because the spirits were like, you have to do this. And of course, I as a sovereign being get to like contest and have feelings and I have, but I'm like, no, you're right. This is what I'm good at. This is what I'm doing now. But there was so much downloading, to borrow a fun new age term, um, at in 2010. There was just so much happening, and I started to be connected. The spirit's synchronicity, fate, weird, connected me to all these people between 2010 to 2012, and I just started to find my accomplices, basically. Not just my spirit accomplices, but my living human accomplices.
Yeah, that is actually super interesting because, I was very active I started looking at this stuff really in like, I don't know the first date. The earliest it could have been would have been 79 because The Spiral
Mhm.
Dance was the first witch book I ever picked up. And I think it was in there because there was a few years before I found the Temple of Psychic Youth.
Mhm.
And that's what led me to some actual magicians that I could kind of sit around with and talk stuff with. Um, so I was very active from 86, 87 up until about 2000, 99, 2000. And somewhere in there, I just hit the wall right around 2000, I think, and was like, okay, I've been doing this for a long time now,
Mhm.
and I need to do something else. And I had a spirit show up in my room while I was wide awake, and I'm non-visual, so
Mhm.
that's kind of a shocking thing when it happens. And it suggested that I needed to make a change, and so I did. And so I dropped all the public stuff, and just would do, I guess people actually stop doing magic after they know it, but I've never been able to. So I was doing a little bit. And that was true until 2010 or 2011. And that's when I began making jewelry again
Yeah.
and ran across Sarah Lawless's Witch of Forest Grove blog back then and was like, oh, there's some interesting folks out here now. Maybe I'll stick my head back in. So I was off for about 10 years and then got sucked back in. And the same thing. I've not done anything that wasn't directly related to magical work in the
Mhm.
world. I've survived off of it now since then.
Mm.
with some rough periods.
Yeah.
But it is there is that shift, and I think it makes sense too because I think that there is a way that I do believe that there is without going into some of the really weird kind of mythology I see around it, there's a very real relationship between kind of, for lack of a better term, I've kind of been talking about it as kind of operative spirituality. So, spirituality that is actually trying to do things with the spirits of this place is how
Yes.
I'm kind of defining that. And I do think that the further we've gone into kind of the scenarios we are due to climate change, due to lots of other things, I do feel like there has been a push from the spirit world forward
Yeah.
and out. And I think I know that that's way, I'm pretty, I mean, the language I use is like they're way up my butt to be public about this stuff.
Yeah.
They're like, no, do it. Don't care. We'll take care of it to the best we can and just do it.
Yeah, and you can ask for that too. I always like to be like, hey, if you're out there doing this work for the, especially the gods, like the spirit, the great spirits that, we might say are gods, like and some of the ancestors and some of the other land whites and stuff, but they actually need you sometimes to remind them that you have particular human needs inside of capitalism in order to thrive, let alone survive. And I think we actually do need to be baseline thriving in order to do this work well. And that's not the baseline, the foundation of that is not high. You know,
It isn't.
be housed, be clothed, have access to, make sure that you have some insulation from the raw elements that might kill you otherwise, and you have like human support and connection, and you can eat, and you have capacity in a way that allows you to respond and relate and ask. And so, yeah, you can just go, hey, I'm just so you know, I'm a human. And if you want me to continue doing this, then you're going to have to support me. And that has been something I have really encouraged people to actually do sorcerously, to go to the cliff or the crossroads, or even if you're someone who accessibility, disability cannot leave your house, you can probably go into a trance far more seamlessly than many others and just go to them and let them know in a powerful, respectful way, because they will powerfully respect you, has been my experience.
I'm like, I'm 100% on board with that. And it's something I do as well. Cause it's like at the point that really the last point when I started coming out after my breakdown a few years ago, that's what I said is it's like, okay, if you're, because they were like, you're doing this. And if you're not doing it, we're going to make you miserable. And I said, okay, so I'll do it because it's what I would prefer to do anyway. But
Yes.
you gotta float this boat. That's not an automatic thing. And my needs are pretty minimal.
Yes.
So, it's like I do not need the Lamborghini. That's not what I'm doing this for.
Hmm.
But I do have to be able to like eat and have shelter and
Yeah.
do the basics. Go 30 years of neglect means I need a bunch of periodontal surgery. You got to
Yeah.
help me get that done in the next few
Yeah.
years, and they do.
Yeah. And they do. Yeah. I'm curious what
But
kind of
yeah,
like magic strategy that you're feeling comfortable to share, that you feel like these times are really calling for, or if not strategy, like ways of relating and thinking that you're noticing the spirits and are like, and you and your divine human animal intelligence is like, this is what I really think we need to be like conversing with.
you know, it's funny. I think since the last time that we chatted, which was not all that long ago, I began playing with the tarot, and it's something that I never kind of got the call to before. And it's been a very entertaining month with that because I'm learning kind of how it works with me. And
Mm,
so, like now, I know the cards that it's referencing me.
mm,
Uh, And it's giving me the same message that I've gotten from my allies and my ancestors in trance regarding everything that is going on right now, which is the card that I keep getting for the situation in the U.S. is the Ten of Swords, which to me is what it is. It's like,
Okay.
okay, that version of this is done.
Yeah.
And that's the messaging that makes sense to me too. But I mean, it's unrelenting that that is the card. If I ask about that comes up. Um, and so to me, that's where so much of my contact is what I call the old line ancestors. And I split that into two parts, or they present as two parts. And so the old line ancestors, there is what I call the bloodline. And this is straight parents, grandparents on back
Hmm.
through time, all the way back to the beginning of life here. Uh, and then there's also like a separate component that it took me a long time to figure out what they were, though I think I mentioned them in my book, Six Ways, that I now call the mist line. And the mist line are like not necessarily related. In my case, they aren't related to the blood, but they're like literally like the sorceress, magical, shamanic worker folks all the way back.
Yes.
And they're crazy loud.
Yes.
And they're like, yeah, change it. And so there's two conversations going on. And so the kind of bloodline, familial, long-term dad are like, fix it, meaning that things are falling apart so bad. Whereas this mistline kind of sorcerer's component is like, no, like really fix it.
Yeah.
Like this is an opportunity
Yeah.
to really fix it.
Yeah.
Um, so most of my work has been connecting to them really consistently, um, and getting a lot of transmission from that. And that's I'm most of the way through a book that is dealing with that, what I've gotten from them, and kind of working that through my filters of the last 40 years of work. But I don't work with deities at all.
Hmm.
Um, So I have one who's shown up, and I'm trying to figure out what that is, but we'll see.
Hmm.
But she's around now. Um, but I think she's hanging out for later. I think she was just letting me know she wanted to watch for a while.
Yeah.
Um, to me, the thing is really like it's like a combination. It's like I did lose my shit really badly about 3.5 years ago, and I've been out of that for coming up on 2 years, I guess. Which I mostly did through different versions of learning about polyvagal theory and
Mm.
applications to deal with that and other somatic methodologies. And that to me is the kind of saving grace right now for most of the folks that I know is like the combination of kind of the cell phone chaos and what that does to us, and then the political chaos and the kind of continuous spectacle of messiness is like step one is how do you get regulated?
Hmm.
Because it's like most people aren't now.
Mm.
And so that's a big focus for me, both learning how to do it myself better and consistently, and then also how to work that into what I teach
Yeah.
and what I share. How do I get that to people who aren't necessarily thinking that way?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, what are you finding for that?
Look, I do. So I do work with the gods, and it was not, and it was not. I guess I grew up with them from a Hindu, a Balinese perspective, but like, I definitely like my craft is so populated by the great spirits or the gods. It's so in connection to them, and it's deeply in connection to the ancestors and, of blood, of land, of the mighty dead. And I totally understand that missed reference. But yeah, and I work with angelic and fairy spirits too, right? Sometimes they're gods, sometimes they're ancestors. And right now it just feels like, hey, put one foot in front of the other if that analogy doesn't work for you, like, one breath and then the next breath, and you actually all know what you're doing. Like if you're honest with yourselves, you all know if you're paying any attention, you are with it. You're actually with it. The wool has been pulled from your eyes, all the towers have fallen. So so you just keep breathing, keep moving, and keep enacting and keep allowing, because we're helping, but you human people beings, you strange primates, you must make art. You must grieve your losses. You must be enraged. You must take care of one another. You must be in the full splendor and complexity of your human animalness. There is no other way. And it's just like there is no other way but through this. And more and more, like I remember a while ago, maybe it was 10 years ago, I heard someone say, "Oh, we're in a magical renaissance right now." And I really see that not just in so-called Western cultures, but everywhere. Like tarot has exploded in Southeast Asian cultures, and people talk about their spirit working traditions and strategies a lot in different cultures that I'm aware of and have contact with. And there's this sense of like a for my whole line for 15 years, if not longer, of public teaching or semi-public teaching has been that, look, we need magic. It is a crucial technology that we ignore at our peril. And I can't be bothered anymore with people going, but I don't even know if it's real. I'm like, cool, whatever. I'm over here. Like that's cool. I get it. I totally get why you're having that conversation with yourself, and I'm happy to talk you through it. But if you want to have that conversation, I'm gonna be really bored. So, and I know that's kind of brutal, but I just at this point, I don't care for it anymore. And I also really like my eyes will roll when I hear people who are witches and occultists and magicians say strange things like, um, which I believe is so essentially dualistic and ridiculous. This idea of like, oh, but we have to do what's practical I'm like, yeah, like magic can be really practical, and if you haven't understood that yet, then I'm curious about your magic. That's the thing, right? Like, look, like magic is not magic is not going to cure you. And what by what I mean by that, like, yes, there are many miraculous cures that can happen through magic, but magic is to me a transmutational process of of working wonders in the world, but it is impacted, of course, by time and by I don't even have to go on by all the forces, but it moves through all the forces. It moves through every force. And that's a very powerful lubricant solvent condition. And already, and again, if we're paying attention, the like look at the situation in the US, it is so the end result of theological weirdness, of magical bizarreness, of cultural entanglement, and the very real impacts of that are because of manifest destiny, Protestant Calvinist strangeness.
Psychosis.
Yeah. And so no wonder they're like, got their prayer warriors and they're like really scared of, they're tracking the witches. And so it's like, look, we probably do need to be a bit undercover more and more. And that's something a lot of communities I'm connected with. Like, I think there's a line we can walk, which is like we can talk about what we're doing, but never really point at it. And I think the mist, I often work with this idea of the mist. It covers and obscures, but propagandists for empire are very good at that too. And they're very good at, I don't know, like inviting delusion and illusion. So yeah, there's a lot of like strangeness going on. And sometimes I like really get into like, Gnosticism and Gnostic concepts of archons and demiurges. And sometimes I think that really explains things, and sometimes I think it's a distraction. But I feel like if we can just go with an idea that, hey, look, you know, like back to some of my own internalizations of fairy teachings, you know, it under the hand of God herself, the peacock angel is the most beautiful spirit. Out of her hand, they are the most terrible. There's something there in that teaching for me, which I think goes back into Sophianic Gnostic Christianity, which deeply influenced the Andersons. But there's this idea of like, look, this evil, sometimes I do call it evil, which is not a word I like very much, but this evil that is being propagated, actually it's part of, like, let's be real and let's not pretend it's external, although it can, of course, but actually we have to deal with this. Every one of us has to deal with this evil, or potential for injustice or whatever it is. I'm just flinging rando words at it at this point. But it's something that is out of willingness and right relationship with the ground of being. And that's, I think, where things get really fucked up. And I look at people like Trump and Musk, and I'm like, this is a clear, like, these are clear icons. Actually, that's really useful, like horrific, magically useful too. Like we can like switch our attention to these icons of Trump and Musk who have taken on sacrificial lamb realness because they're like, behold, I am God. Like it's so demiurge, it's hilarious to the point where you're like, oh, actually, I know how to deal with this. So strategically, magically, I'm like, oh, there's actually ways to deal with exactly what you're doing. Thank you for just laying yourself on the altar like that. Unfortunately, there's also very real horrific impacts for marginalized people and land and seas and the air. But they really are putting themselves directly in the path of a lot of stuff, actually, which they're gonna. I really feel like they are their own worst enemies too, as well as the other reality of them impacting and harming so many systems of life.
Yeah, I mean that's where I go. I've like become I'm like getting I try not to become a reductionist about it all, but I
Yes.
get simpler and simpler. And
Yes.
some of this is age, I know that because I've been at this for a long, long time. And I move deeper and deeper into this sense of a very animist field that we're in. Uh, and its nature is consciousness, its nature is interconnection, interdependence, kind of immanence and enmeshment. And I look at all of this stuff that, like everything that you just described, is like, how do we get what we want and ignore that?
Hmm.
and, and so that's really where my allies and the folks that kind of guide my work are like straight up, just like get out there and say, like, no, that's a non-viable approach. That's a pathological view. It's
Yeah.
actually not it's actually incorrect. It's
Hmm.
like so
Yeah.
incorrect
Yeah.
that it has to be viewed that way. And
Hmm.
there's been this process for a long time of this idealization of I will get mine and put myself in the castle in some fashion. And this
Mm.
is everything from the big suburban home with the picket fence
Yeah.
to the fucking Trump Towers or my golf
Yeah.
course or whatever, you know.
Hmm.
There's levels. Um, Whereas the solution to all of this stuff is really like deep admission of this interdependence
Yes.
on all levels, because then it brings up all of these conversations and all these like things that we heard about in school, at least when I was going to school in California at the time. You know, they would give you these like truisms about various cultures that God knows if they were true at all, but you know, about like the standard one that was out was that some tribes, and I'm sure it got passed on to all tribes in our teaching, was you know that they would try and look 7 generations ahead. Like, look, these guys aren't even looking a week ahead.
Mm.
Like, this is not about that. This is about how do I get mine right the fuck now? And you go, well, that will never work Because if you do that, you're never going to do anything to take care of yourself or anybody else.
Mm.
And this belief that we can amass so much capital to be absolved from reality is just absurd.
Yeah.
And so hopefully this is a point where that breaks. And that's where you're saying kind of where that's another view of saying that they've kind of set themselves up
Yeah.
as such icons of this thing that maybe that's a really, maybe that's what it has to take to shatter that story. Like, well, why do you think people that have hundreds of billions of dollars are still trying to make more money? Like,
Yeah.
what part of that speaks to you of like psychological or emotional rightness?
Yeah.
Like, how is that desirable?
Yeah.
Most of our, for hundreds of thousands of years, we've been trying to keep ourselves and our families and our children fed and alive, uh, and that was the goal, and that still needs to be the goal. And if you take that to its logical conclusions, then you're like, how do we protect the air? How do we protect the land? How do we
Mm.
protect the people who are getting run over by the folks that are so unwell that they don't know this?
Yeah.
Uh, and that's a lot of the focus of my work is directed at that kind of how do I feed that at the root? How do I get that like really grounded, felt sense of that animate reality, that interwoven and enmeshed reality available to as many people as I can
Yeah.
with this, you know, larger than some, smaller than many's platform that I have. And so that's what I'm trying to do because I think it's like it is, it's not the entirety of the cure probably, but it is a part of a cure. That the more people that get like, no, I'm not going to do that because that's not good for whatever, whether that is the squirrels and the owls or whether that is my neighbors, having that sense to go, yeah, I could do that. And maybe that would give me a sense of safety or a sense of fulfillment. But is that what I'm really looking for? Is that the way I want to get there? Because
Mm.
there are other ways, you know? And I
Mm.
think that magic is a key into that. And I believe that for a lot of us, it's a necessary thing. I don't think it's optional. My breakdown was because I backed away too far.
Yeah.
I tried to go, let me just opt out. And they were like, no,
Mm.
not legit. You have
Yeah.
agreements with us.
Yeah.
Uh, and so you can either deal with that not being in place or you can get back on the horse. And it's like, okay, let's get back on the horse.
I think a lot of I've been reflecting lately on a lot of like the customs of cultures and even though I think evolution and adaptation is absolutely always essential and the idea of an ossified tradition is I think horrific.
It's terrible.
But when I think about religious tradition, religious philosophical mystical traditions like the many forms of Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, paganism, whatever, I think there is this commonality where all of those systems of worldview and ethics or whatever, there is this thing where they're saying hey, collectively, we have to have a boundary, whether we call it hubris or greed, or we need to acknowledge that if we transgress that, terrible things will occur. Um, and I see, like, as someone who is more of a mystic and a sorcerer than a religionist, although I can do that if I need, um, that I see that and I go, yeah, that's real. Like I think that the humility to be of the earth is essential, which I think is really ironic sometimes when we look at anthropological understandings of what sorcery, sorcery as these like antisocial, and often I'm like, well, antisocial in the sense that maybe originally those tribes or villages or cultures just recognized that they were like completely other and pushed them out and went to them when they needed and da 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 da, da, and so often the witch, I think, as a witch, so often the witch is this I've said and written that this she shows the face that humanity needs to see at that time to challenge us, basically, whether it's the ugly child-eating monster or the beautiful, this apparently gorgeous, beautiful, radiant queen, or this feminist on the steps of institution ripping down a flag, or these, queers in the bottom of a basement. Like the witch, she just keeps morphing and changing all the time because she's bringing from the non-human a constant reminder of the forest, of the volcano, of the underworld, of the inner world, and saying, "Hey, fairy stories are real. Think about that before you go and build that tower, which will fall." And I and just think about that, hey? And also, if we have to bind and curse you to remind you, we will. And I understand that, breaking out of that context, there's all kinds of sorcery and magic and witchery that maybe I personally wouldn't be doing, but that is, part and parcel of societies kind of losing the plot. But I think it's very interesting that at a period, that the city of Rome once can't remember what year this was, but it happened several times where they expelled all of the sorcerers, magicians, and oracles. They expelled them from and this is prior to them becoming Christian, from the city of Rome, because they're terrified. Like empires like that, or societies like that, they're just terrified of being undermined by otherworldly forces that might remind them that there are consequences. Yeah.
No. Well, and I think you and I talked last time we talked, maybe, about this idea that, like, if I think it's very reasonable to think that what we're looking at, as far as kind of the most egregious manifestations of what's wrong in the world now, are functionally spiritual illnesses, right?
Hmm.
And so, and if we just kind of go back to like tribal situations, well, there's an issue because the folks that actually want to be at the top of hierarchies don't tend to be healthy
Yeah.
from that viewpoint. And so, of course, whoever is in charge of kind of the health of the tribe is going to come in and go, look, you need to go sit in the cave with me for a couple of months and get your shit back together.
Mm,
Because no, what we don't need is to go take over the people on the other side of the hill. What
mm,
we need is to get, the wood and the fiber and the meat in for the winter.
mm,
And we get that that is boring.
mm, mm,
Basic work. It isn't cool. There's nobody's going to write you a saga for that shit.
mhm. Yeah.
Uh, and I think that that is also kind of what that archetype of this kind of spiritual, someone who's kind of, yeah, who's walking with a foot on either side,
Mm,
is going like, no, not legit.
mm,
Of course, they're going to be hated by the folks that want that to be not discussed.
yeah.
Like, no, I came up with a really good story about why we need to go take those people over. Uh, I have all of this stuff about honor and glory and all of that shit.
Mm,
And, get some slaves and you won't have to work as hard. And you
yeah.
have the people that are connected going, no, that's not the way you get there, dude. This planet is not about not working.
Yeah, and that brings me to those like wild conspiracy theories, which may or may not touch on some form of otherworldly accuracy, but where people basically come up with all these ideas to externalize these wrongdoings and basically say, oh, it's reptilians from the planet whatever, or from this galaxy, or and then people obviously that alone is very anti-Semitic, connected to this trope, oh, it's this cabal from Kabbalah of this group of people, or it's the witches, or it's the Christians, or it's these evil spirits coming up from the ground, like all kinds of ridiculous conspiracy theories, and shadow demons, da da da. And I'm like, it could be, but interdependence is a thing, and also humans are centers of agency as well, and we're kind of spirits too. So I think it's just probably more healthy and pragmatic to be like, what if it's just us making shitty decisions? You know? Yeah.
I've been talking a lot about one of the things that's really interesting is if you're wired in a particular way, none of these things really ever occur to you because you'd rather take care of the kids or play with the kids or
Mm.
go fishing or make something. Uh, and it's I think that kind of just the idea of kind of civilizations, whether that's on a really small, even tribal group, are difficult because that is, I think, a large majority of the population is
Mm.
just trying to do life well.
Yeah.
But there's this other chunk that is like, ooh, but we could amass power.
Yeah.
And that would be really cool. And it's like, well, you've got somebody who's really single minded about amassing power without really concern of cost, as long as it isn't one that they have to pay.
Mm.
But everybody else is actually really busy trying to have a
Yeah.
good life and does not wish to spend the time to
Mm.
continuously check that impulse.
Yeah.
And to me, that's another kind of message that I get from my peeps is they're like, that's not really been happening for a long time. Those
Yeah.
impulses have been deified.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
whether
That's very
that's,
cool.
Blackpink singing about their Lamborghini goes vroom, 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 it's a particular,
Mm.
it's like an iconic part of our culture
Mm.
now that the goal is ostentatious wealth.
Sure.
And you go, that's so much not what any spiritual system has ever suggested
Hmm.
is the goal here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
And
that's a unifying form.
I think the key is that ostentatious or that like that lauding or that hoarding. I think, obviously I can think of several occultists who would disagree with us vigorously right now, and that's
Oh
okay.
yeah.
Like I'm happy to debate them on this. I am an anti-capitalist, so I like of course I'm gonna say these things. Um, but I think the thing that I'm not worried about people growing wealth when they understand that it's connected to the wealth of and life force of all these other systems. And I know
Yeah.
that there are people out there doing that, but I just think to the point where you, want to hoard power and financial wealth in the systems as they are. Like again, it's these systems, right? It's these like so many people don't even know, often myself, how we would even like protest it or like dismantle it. But again, that brings me back to just like one movement, then the next, one breath, then the next, and constantly relating to each other in artful, loving, fierce ways. I do think that undermines this disconnection isolationist thing that and the nuclear family thing because I've seen so many people I know and love can become like they only, especially if they're not part of queer communities or witch communities or art communities, they often only have gender like kind of capitalist gender roles to revert to once they have children, and so then they reify these like nuclear families, they become isolated, da, 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 da. And I'm just like, ugh, this system is so good at like making people feel so helpless because it kind of disables it disables on many levels all kinds of people, and it's good at basically saying no matter what you do, I'm more powerful and have more money, so you're fucked. And
Hmm.
unless you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get here with me, you're irrelevant. And so then, and then the social media thing kind of captures that panic and that internal like that like sense of like, fuck, well then I have to prove that I'm really, I don't know, that I'm developing and progressing and happy and whatever it is, rather than messy and complicated and striving for connection in a world that disables connection.
Yeah. It's I've been leading a lot of guided stuff through the Zooms that I'm doing, actually, that you got me into. I was like, oh, I know how to do that too. doing it with you. I forgot. It's been a long time since I've been in group work. Uh, and that's been a really beautiful thing to see because I have got such a memory kind of in my body of different things that hung me up. Like it's very easy for me to like kind of walk through those in real time. And I don't know that I'm picking up on people specifically that are present, but that may well be happening. Uh, but it is because it's like people are like, wow, it's like I've not been in a situation where someone has given me so much permission to experience this in so many different ways. Uh, or simply to be the watcher if I'm not connecting at all. And that's what, and to me, it's tied into that same thing. It's like, no, because we're just trying to figure out how to be together. We're trying to figure out how to be more connected to the world as it really is. We're trying to be more connected to the allies or the spirits or the gods, however we view those things. And that's all process. It's not static. It's not calcified. It's
Yeah.
not, it can't be. And I think especially right now, we're in a super transitional phase. And so I think leaning into that is a very potent thing right now is to go like, look, we don't know what is magic going to look like in 20 years in the United
Mm.
States. That's a really interesting thing. It could all be totally underground.
Yeah.
Who
Yeah, and
knows?
maybe we'll be forced underground. Sometimes
Exactly.
I see certain trajectories or certain threads of time and effect and consequence, and I'm like, ugh, so that's always a reality. But even in times of persecution, like if,
It's
uh,
always been.
yes,
It
and
has been.
depending
We've
on
been
how
doing
you
this
are.
forever.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, and then there's that service magician, even though they could any second be accused of witchery. Like, so it's just like it depends. It depends. It's so complicated. And I feel like to kind of bring this to some kind of close, but I think we could have multiple conversations. I just feel like right now, yeah, it is precarious, but in that precarity, there's a great deal of generative possibility. It's that whole knife's edge, eye of the needle, like crucible moment where I think almost anything is possible because I think that's the thing we need to remind ourselves magically because we're like, what the fuck? How is this even happening? That could make us then go, wait a second, if that's happening, then this could happen. And so the
Yes.
plasticity and versatility of the threads right now is profound. And um, I do feel the presence of many powers pressing in and being like, okay, how intriguing. What are you going to do about it? So that's you know, it's a sorcerously potent moment, really.
I'm super there. It's something that I keep kind of bringing up is that idea. It's like, yes, there's objectively terrible things that are happening, but the systems that were in place were objectively terrible in a different way.
Hmm.
And so if this is how we get to the other side, this is how we get to the other side. And that seems to be what my allies are suggesting. They're like, yeah, it's like they give me interesting stuff, but they do suggest that the other side is more interesting here. This is not. It wasn't. We were not in a happy, healthy system, uh, kind of socio politically. And
Mm.
the last thing that I would throw in is also interesting is one of the words that I use for the things that I work with when I'm making my offerings is I reference all of the beautiful powers.
Mm.
And 2 days ago, that one of those many voices that steps in was added to that. And so that's, I was like, oh, interesting. And so I began making an offering to all of the beautiful and terrible powers.
Mm.
And it's like, there's stuff stirring that is really deep and is really potent and is really available and becoming more available. And
Yeah.
so there is, as you said, it's like the chaos is a potential to reform into something quite lovely. And that doesn't mean there will not be a lot of collateral damage
Yeah.
and a
And there
lot of
is and
people
has been.
dropped off. and it's already happening there. It always has been happening. Right now it's very evident for a lot of people that it wasn't before, but it's never not been happening. And
Hmm.
so my thing is like, yeah, let's what's that thing that I used to hear said a lot? Oh, that you want to leave this place better than you found it. Like this is a moment that you might be able to do that,
Yeah.
and don't let that get obscured by the kind of chaos and panic.
Totally. I just, yeah, I want to chorus what you just said because when you just said the beautiful, terrible powers, there's something in like the wildwood tradition of witchcraft where we talk about the love, truth, and wisdom of the lady. And we say that if you're really in relationship, wrestling, dancing with that, then you will be touched by the terrible beauty of all things. It's the poetry of it.
Hmm.
The terrible beauty of all things. And that is for me the whole fucking point. I'm I'm here to be touched by and touch the terrible beauty of all things, of which I am a child. I am a child of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm with you there.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Let's do this again. This has been really
Absolutely.
beautiful.
It was a super pleasure. And thank you for suggesting it. I'm stoked. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.